Good afternoon and welcome to our webcast, Keyboard Criminals, Protecting Your Business from Cyberattacks. For those of you who I've not yet met, I'm Dan Meyer, publisher of BizTimes Media. Today's webcast is presented by BT360, the storytelling arm of BizTimes Media. On behalf of BT360, BizTimes, and our sponsors, Godfrey & Kahn, R&R Insurance Services, and Sikich, thank you for attending. The ongoing challenges of the pandemic and the vast numbers of remote workers have created a perfect storm and are overwhelming companies of all sizes with IT security threats. Experts say it's not if you'll be a target, but rather when. Today we'll talk about what you need to do to mitigate your risks and costs when you do get attacked. You'll also learn what to do if and when you are targeted. Our presenters will provide their perspectives and share tips, insights, and other strategies that can protect your data, your employees, and your customers. They will address the weaknesses and tactics used by attackers in the most common cybersecurity breaches today, how good security helps reduce your legal risk, security policies every business should have in place, how cyber criminals prey on your employees, how to build a strategic cyber continuity plan before the incident occurs. The slide deck will be available after you fill out the attendee survey at the conclusion. Before we begin, on behalf of BizTimes Media, I'd like to thank you for your readership support and for your print and digital advertising support and event sponsorships, and for attending this webcast today. This is our 25th year as an independent, family-owned business, and we're the only locally owned business media company in the region. To serve this community for 25 more years, we'll continue to need your marketing and advertising support now more than ever. I guarantee that we'll work very hard every day to earn your business and to help you grow your business through our custom and integrated marketing programs. If you're interested, please contact our sales director, Linda Crawford. In addition, our award-winning editorial team is always looking for story ideas, especially forward-looking operational insight stories that can help our readers make more informed decisions in running their company or insights on how to be better leaders themselves. And recently, we launched an insider subscriber program. For $8 a month, you can be an insider and receive several insider benefits, including access to all the content produced by our editorial team. It's also your opportunity to support local journalism. So before I introduce the presenters, I want to mention that today's webcast is being recorded and will be available on demand on our website tomorrow. And upon conclusion of the program, please fill out the attendee survey to access the slide deck. So now on to our presenters. When I introduce you, please give a quick shout out to everyone. So our presenters are Jason Navarro, Cyber Crime Director with R&R Insurance Services. Jason?
Thanks, Dan. Definitely looking forward to sharing all the information we can to help people and really get more strategic on this unfortunate area that continues to improve.
Our next presenter is Kevin Bong, Director of Cybersecurity with Sikich. Kevin, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. Yeah, my job is to scare you, so.
Yeah, and he's a pretty scary guy. Sarah Sargent, Associate with Godfrey & Kahn. Hi, Sarah. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here and glad you could join us.
And Zach Willenbrink, Associate with Godfrey & Kahn. Welcome, Zach.
Thanks, Dan.
So during the presentation and discussion, please submit any questions you have by using the Q&A feature on your screen. Not the chat feature, but really stick to the Q&A feature. So in our program, and our agenda today is how attackers gain a foothold, an anatomy of an attack, what legal obligations to consider, common pitfalls, and preparation and protection. So now I would like to turn it over to Jason Navarro, again, the Cybercrime Director at R&R Insurance Services. Jason.
Thanks, Dan. Like we all mentioned on the phone today, this is an opportunity for us to share a little bit more information with you all out there. Unfortunately, our world every day is dealing with the ramifications and terrible effects of cybercrime. And we all have our unique specialties and our areas that we focus on. And today we want to share a little bit with you on how to help mitigate and prevent some of that. And we wanted to start off with sharing some of the ways how easy this is for criminals to attack organizations and individuals alike. And as we've gone through COVID, especially, there's more and more opportunities to attack people now that there's more remote workers, and the criminals prey on that. And actually, they've dumbed down and less sophisticated attacks on organizations and individuals. And one of the easiest ways, and we'll get into more specifics here in a little bit throughout the presentation, but one of the easiest ways to attack organizations is through a process called social engineering. And so while we're going to get into some technical areas and some of this is going to be extremely scary, we wanted to start off on the flip side with a little bit of a lighthearted video, but one that gets exactly to what the heart of social engineering is. And for those of you who are not familiar with social engineering, it's basically a criminal using psychological warfare or social profiling of you to attack you to gain information for what they're trying to obtain. And so they can do that a few different ways. Vishing, which is voice solicitation, phishing, which you may have heard of, which is through electronic solicitation, or actually stopping out in person and pretending to be someone that they're not. So we're going to show you a quick 2-minute video here of an actual real-life professional hacker and how she goes about obtaining information through the phone.
So I invited a few of the world's best hackers to try to hack me and show me where my vulnerabilities are. And now I'm going to meet them in Las Vegas for DEF CON, the biggest hacker convention of the year. They're going to hack me using social engineering, which is essentially hacking without any code. They just use a phone and an internet connection.
Do you want to do a sample phishing call?
What's phishing?
Phishing is voice solicitation, and basically what you do is you use the phone to extract information or data points that can be used in a later attack.
Let's do it.
Okay.
Who are you going to call?
Maybe I'll call your cell phone provider and
Okay.
see if I can get them to give me your email address.
I bet they're good. I bet they have my back. But yeah, go for it.
I'm going to spoof from your number, so it's going to look like it's calling from you.
Okay.
Hi, I'm so sorry. Can you hear me okay? My baby, I'm sorry. my husband's like, we're about to apply for a loan and we just had a baby and he's like, get this done by today. So I'm so sorry. I can't call you back. I'm trying to log into our account for uses information and I can't remember what email address we used to log the account. The baby's crying and can you help me? Awesome.
In just 30 seconds,
At gmail.com?
Jessica gets access to my personal email address.
Now, if I needed to add our older daughter on our account so she could call in and make changes, how would I need to go about doing that? You would have to send me a secure PIN through a text message? Yeah, well, the thing is, I don't think I'll be able to receive a text message if I'm on the phone. Shh. Oh, I'm not on there either? So I thought when we got married, he added me to the account.
Jess uses my girlfriend's name and a fake social security number
5127.
to set up her own personal access to my account.
Wait, I'm sorry, so there's no password on my account right now? Can I set that up?
She even gets the support person to change my password.
Thank you so much for your help today.
So she just basically blocked me out of my own account.
I'll get her fed after this. All right, thank you.
Holy shit. So they just gave you access to my entire cell phone account.
You're gonna have to go on and change your password now because it's Jess, my name.
And all it took was a crying baby and a phone call.
Yeah.
So that reaction is what a lot of people go through when they've been through one of these incidents. And what we try to do with that lighthearted video is show just exactly how social profile somebody ahead of time and search all of their Facebook, Instagram, Twitter accounts. We'll know what they do in real life, and then we will use that against them at work. And we will pretend to talk about something that they're interested in because we know they will answer that phone call, they will answer that email. And that's why social engineering works so well. And now a lot of you are saying out there right now, probably, what's the big deal? She got my email, right? Not a big long-term ramification. We're going to show you a next slide here where we used ourselves as an example. And the next gentleman that you're going to hear from, Kevin at Sikich, Kevin's a professional hacker. So we said, hey, if we're going to preach this on our end, and if we're going to work with customers and help them get better, we need to be as good as we possibly can be. And so the big deal about getting someone's email account, it's kind of like the holy grail to their life. It's controls and contains all of their information. And so people, by using passwords over and over and over, once you as a hacker gain somebody's email account, you have the ability to control their whole life. So we're going to show you another quick video here and demonstrate what can happen when somebody gains your email account.
All right, well, how might we make use of them? Well, let's just search through for a certain company, for example, R&R Insurance. So I'm going to grep, which allows us to search for text and files, -I in case insensitive, R recursive, rrins.com, and we're going to search that breach compilation list. Now, this is a big directory, 42 gigabytes, so it'd take, maybe 5 minutes or longer to search the whole directory. But we can see we're getting results already right away.
All right, so what that is every time somebody uses a work email address for something other than work purposes and there's a breach associated with it, the hackers are pretty proud of what they do. They like to show off and brag. They post that information on what's called the dark web. These folks that you see here, these are real individuals. These are some of my counterparts that work at our organization. Their information has been compromised at one point or time through a breach, and it's posted out on the dark web. Their email address and the password associated. And as we talked about before, when people use the same passwords over and over and over for multiple sites, the hackers now have algorithms and programs that will just sit and spin and search all of your personal financial accounts, credit cards, bank information, other Hotmail and email and Gmail accounts. They will get information on you and they can use that against you personally to extort you and or your business, and it's a way into the organization. So we wanted to start today to show you how easy it is to obtain that information. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kevin, who we're going to get into a little bit more details on what a hacker would do.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, the next slide here, make sure I'm not muted. So all that stuff that you just saw happens in the background. You don't see the phishing happen or the vishing happen. You don't see them stealing your dark web passwords. For most of us, for the most common attacks we see today, which are these ransomware attacks, this is how it happens for us as employees, as a company. We walk in Monday morning and the help desk is ringing off the hook. People can't get to their applications. When they look at their folders, it looks like this. All my files have weird names, and I'm getting some message that all my files are encrypted. And this is a big change from kind of the ransomware of the past. I think you were kind of 5-10 years ago aware of ransomware that was a virus that infected your computer, and to unlock your computer, you'd have to pay the ransom. That's not how it happens today. How it happens today is the attackers got access to your corporate network 2-3 weeks ago, spent that time hunting around your network, finding your backups, finding your important servers, and all planning until almost every time, like a Friday night after everybody's gone, to start encrypting data. So when you come in Monday morning, this is what you find. My data is encrypted and we can't work, and now what? If we go to the next slide, as a first step, kind of now what? Well, hopefully you've got an incident response plan. Sarah, you want to talk more about what we look for in that kind of plan?
Yeah, so the first thing, when you walk in Monday morning, like Kevin said, one of your biggest questions is going to be, what now? So a big piece of that is going to be pulling out your incident response plan. And before my colleague Zach gets into this, I just want to say another thing that we're also seeing is not only do they get in and they try to deploy ransomware, that virus that encrypts your data, they spend time also moving data off your system. And so we're seeing now more attackers that are getting into your system. They are not only deleting your backups if they can get to them, but they are also exporting data off of your system. And that is another leverage point that they can ransom you for. So they'll move sensitive, confidential information, social security numbers, whatever they can get your hands on to move those out. And so, Zach, did you want to go a little bit further into this slide?
Sure, thanks, Sarah. We'll talk more specifically about what you specifically want in your incident response plan a bit later, but typically your first steps are going to be getting your team together. So your internal team, anybody you've set up who who you want to participate in the response. And then hopefully you've also spoken with an attorney, you've got a broker or insurer who you have a good relationship with, and you can gather this team all together. You can start pulling your important documents, so your insurance policies or relevant contracts that might come up.
I hope they're not on the file server that just got encrypted. So keep that in mind too.
Absolutely. You should have a plan for that. You should have them probably printed out somewhere that you can access them, you know, in your office. You've got them separately stored on a file management system outside of your office that's been ransomwared. And then once you've got your group of folks together, one thing to do is to consider initiating a forensic response. So that's talking to somebody like Kevin, somebody at Sikich, or similar, to determine, you know, how you're going to respond. So maybe Kevin's going to step in and help you stem the tide from what's happening, or, you know, at least be at the ready to sort of do the post-mortem and figure out exactly what happens. One thing you certainly want to do is communicate with your internal team and external team very, very carefully. We're seeing more and more data breach litigation, and as soon as litigation starts, pretty much anything that you were saying during the attack or immediately after could be discoverable. And so you want to avoid, you know, bemoaning, oh, we should have done this or we should have done that, because that sort of thing can be very valuable to a plaintiff who later sues you. And then preserve your records, you know, monitor what steps you've taken so that if you ever do get into litigation, you can actually prove, you know, that you were doing adequate things while the breach was happening. And so you have evidence, you know, to support the fact that you were taking adequate steps. And I think we'll go to the next slide, and Kevin will join back in with, you know, more things you might see for a typical breach.
Yeah. Just to reinforce that, preserve your records as well. That's the hardest part on that first day for your IT staff. Like, they're anxious to get back up and running. We often see everybody moves a little too fast, forgets who deleted this file or rebooted the server, or you know, just not, like, days or weeks later, not having changed things or having done things and not having a record of who or what did things. You know, because everybody's moving so fast on that first day and not being methodical and not recording their actions. So yeah, definitely going to reinforce that. But this is kind of, you know, we're kind of going through a scenario here. So we walked in on Monday morning, 8 o'clock, and saw that our stuff was encrypted. Well, now it's a couple hours later. We've been starting to try and figure out what to do. And now the hackers reached out to us. They say they've deleted, or they've encrypted our data, deleted our backups, and they want us to reach out and start talking to them to get our data back. So this is a whole nother aspect of that's new to a lot of the industry in terms of getting hacked, and do I interact with the hacker, and how do I, and what does that mean? I don't know if Jason or Sarah, Zach, if you guys have kind of suggestions on this.
Yeah, I'll take it from our perspective. So really there's two parallels that can be running on this type of scenario. Folks who have planned ahead of the incident and have this reaction and strategic continuity plan in place, where they've got either their insurance program in place that's going to pay for all of this and handle all of the services and resources side. And then option B, running parallel, would be the folks that don't have one of those in place, but do have the legal side, the IT side set up. You've got to make sure that that's done ahead of time. In our experience, you do not want to be talking to these people directly. They are trained negotiators. There are people on the other side that should be doing that for you. It's exactly like a hostage crisis negotiation situation. You're not trained in this area. You should not be jumping in and handling it from either the IT side or on Sarah and Zach's side on the legal side. So that's what our expertise is, and that's why, again, it's so important to have this plan in place before the incident occurs, so that everybody does know their role and responsibilities. Sarah and Zach?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We also recommend that if you are going to engage with someone who is holding you ransom, your network ransom, that it is a professional that's doing it. And another reason that is because professionals like Kevin, like Sickage, they often see the same attacker over and over again. They often know what works best in negotiating with them because they're able to see these patterns. And so they might know that a particular attacker is willing to drop the ransom fee 50%, or that, you know, they're willing to take a couple $1,000 to get information decrypted. So there are lots of patterns that having professionals like Sickage can really help come in and negotiate better for you than if you're unfamiliar with this attacker and you're unfamiliar with how to respond in a ransomware situation.
Yeah, and even if you don't intend to pay the ransom, a lot of organizations just have that hard line, no matter what, we're not going to pay it. Sometimes there can be a benefit to reach out and negotiate just to give yourself more time during those negotiations, because then you've got a little more time to prepare for maybe if they post something to the internet or something like that. So you might want to consider, do we do that just to buy time, even though we know we're not going to end up paying any ransom? Next slide. So that's what's kind of happening, and now you've got new information coming from your IT staff. They've gone about doing the research, finding what the impact was, and come back to the incident response team and say, hey, you know, all of our critical file shares are encrypted. We've got some key application servers that are entirely encrypted. Those applications can't run. And more often than you'd like to know, not only that, but all of our backups, the storage appliance that holds all that backup data, that's been factory reset, and we can't get to our backup data anymore either. Oh, and by the way, the firewall shows that 10 gig of data, you know, seemed to be the same attacker, went to some Eastern European countries, you know, in the last few days before everything got encrypted. So really bad news from IT coming in here. But surprisingly, this is a very real story that we see in a lot of ransom attacks. You know, certainly from the IT perspective, the biggest questions are, where else might we have that data? Do we have some offline backups? What can we recreate? Is there anything that we absolutely would have to buy back from the attacker to stay in business? But there's a lot of other considerations when you get to this point as well.
Yeah, and I would also just add too that it's really important that if you do have an outsourced IT provider, that you know explicitly how they are handling your backups. The number of times that I have worked with a client who has an outsourced IT provider, they think that they're having a full backup done that's offsite and offline, and it ends up that actually they were only backing up 50% of it. Or we were only backing up XYZ applications, but not the entire network. So really knowing what your IT provider is doing as far as backups is really critical, especially for small businesses that do that outsourcing quite often.
So next slide. So now, you know, you've been down for a little while, and now you're starting to see the customer impact. Your customers are calling the call center because the web services are down. Your business partners can't place orders. You know, your employees are asking for what they should tell these customers. And yeah, you've got a lot of things this incident team has to consider beyond just kind of getting back up and running. But how do we deal with all this information and questions coming at us?
Yeah, so another big piece of this is, you know, if there is a customer impact, if it is very clearly that you're not able to provide the services you're providing, you know, if, how, and when do you notify your customers is a really big question. And it's something that you shouldn't do until you've talked to an attorney. And that's because you might have legal obligations to notify them in a certain way. So every state, as Zach's going to talk about a little bit later, has data breach notification laws. And so you might have to notify them in a particular way. You also might not have a notification obligation depending on what a forensic investigation reveals. And so you want to be very careful with messaging to outside parties. That includes customers and vendors. And it also can include your internal employees. You know, if you are running a bigger company, you might not want to be in a position where you're posting up a banner or loudly announcing that you've had some kind of situation where an unauthorized third party or a hacker has gotten into your system. So being really careful about that messaging is really important. And a lot of times people will, you know, their knee-jerk reaction is we need to tell everyone and be upfront and just disclose everything. That's probably not going to be in your best interest, even though it might be, you know, what you feel like is the right thing to do as a business owner. So I just recommend everyone take a pause, see what your attorney says about kind of how do we proceed in the best way. And another thing is, I know a lot of people, when they have an incident, they immediately focus on customers. You know, what's the customer impact? And they often forget they have a ton of employee data. So it is really important to remember that you do have employee data on your systems. That might be social security numbers, that might be benefits information, it might be your payroll information. So really remembering, hey, our employees might be negatively impacted here, and how that would impact, you know, the morale around the company, and, you know, your legal risk as well.
Yeah, one of the things I would add that we see in this is exactly like Sarah said, people want to get out in front of this because they think it's the right thing to do. The reason you see both Kevin's side and Sarah and Zach's side on this call is because when you have one of these incidents, you are running two parallel paths at the exact same time. There is a legal team that's fighting for your best interest and looking out to protect you in that situation under notification laws, and from a brand reputation standpoint, and your employees and your organization's safety. And then the IT response team is fighting from that side as well. So you've got to work with both parties carefully. And again, let the experts handle their respective lines of the path that they're fighting for you.
Next slide, please.
Yeah, and so I can take over from there, because I think there's, you know, a really good point to make following on that. You know, in a lot of ways, it's going to be a business decision when, how, if you tell your customers, but there's going to be a legal requirement in some instances that you tell your customers, or that you tell impacted parties that you suffered a breach. So I think we could probably have at least a full presentation, possibly a full day, going through all the different breach notification requirements. But from a high level, what we're seeing really is that there's a patchwork of regulations, state laws across the country. And when we say patchwork, we mean it. There's different requirements of who is required to be notified, different requirements applicable to different industries that have to provide notification, different requirements based on the type of information that's accessed or acquired. And all of those different things really impact what you have to provide in terms of notification. So sometimes it's to a state attorney general, sometimes it's to the individuals who are impacted, sometimes both. The two really important points I think to take away from this is we can't give you, individual advice on each state without, knowing exactly what's going on. So a forensic investigation is going to really help you and help an attorney help you determine what's legally required. So the forensic investigation, probably just a post-mortem, is going to jump in there and be able to tell, who was impacted, what sort of information was impacted. And those two pieces of information, somebody like Sarah and I can jump in, use that information, and determine what state laws are going to apply, how those state laws apply, so that we can help you decide exactly who needs to be notified and how they need to be notified. One fortunate thing here to note is that you've typically got a bit of time. No states require, an immediate notification. Some states do require notification to go out as soon as possible. Some set a very short time frame, like 30 days. But there's no requirement of immediacy. So take care of your breach first. Try to get that situation under control. But you don't want to sit on your hands. You do want to know that you're going to have potentially, and I think in this world that we're living in now, I think you could say it's probably likely you're going to have some sort of breach notification obligation. So I think we'll go to the next slide, which is a scenario in which you probably would wish you were deciding whether or not you had to notify.
Yeah. So as Sarah said, ideally you're gonna have the time to work with your attorney to plan your announcement, to control that messaging. But more and more nowadays, that's not the case. These ransomware companies now, in addition to encrypting all your data, are starting to set up these what they call shaming sites, where they list your company name, your URL, and say, hey, we've broken into this company. They weren't protecting their data very well. Here's a small set of what we stole, and if they don't work with us to secure their environment, we're going to publish the rest of what they stole right here in like a week or 2 weeks or something. So they've kind of even taken the control away from the victims to manage even that messaging to some extent. Sarah, Zach, what can we do about this?
Yeah, so this is going to be one of the areas where you really want to think about, how do we handle this from a PR perspective? And as Jason can talk about, sometimes you can have insurance coverage that also will handle you from a PR perspective, because if there's going to be a blast out to the world that, hey, this company had a security issue, you really have to think through, okay, how do we message that? So having a PR professional can be really helpful. Additionally, this might impact how you handle your notification obligations. I would love to tell you that every time I work with someone that a business decides, hey, there could have been some access, therefore we're going to notify everyone. That's often not the case. A lot of companies will decide that, we're going to make a risk-based call that this information isn't at risk here, and so we're not going to provide notification. If you get on one of these websites where it's public knowledge and it can show up in Google that you had a security issue, that choice is really taken away from you. So that's something that is really important to consider. And, the number of hackers out there that have Twitter accounts and love to post clips of information from companies that they've hacked is pretty high. This happened recently to a law firm actually in New York that handled a lot of celebrity clients. And there were a number of documents from celebrities, legal documents, that were leaked online because this law firm refused to pay the ransom. And so it's something to consider when you're thinking through your incident response plan.
And I think also important, this just highlights why it's so important to put these pieces in place now before the attack happens, to have your incident response partner identified, to have legal counsel identified, to have your contacts for cyber insurance, because the time between something bad happening and you needing to do all these, you could be already on the internet while you're still negotiating contracts with those firms if you don't have those relationships already in place.
So I did see a particular question, and we'll make sure we get to them at the end. We have a lot of time, but I think there's one really important one that I think we should address, which is, there is a saying in the security world that it is not a if you get hacked, but when, or if you have a security incident, but it's when you have one. I will completely say, and Kevin and Jason can give their opinion, but is that true? And I would say absolutely it is true. At some point, every company is going to have some kind of security incident. It could be small, it could have no long-term impacts on your company, but I would say that it is a question of when, not if.
Absolutely, it's going to happen to every organization within the next few years. The numbers are staggering with the frequency of how many customers we see getting attacked just on a weekly basis, and even year over year, the stats are the curve is like that. It's astronomical.
Yeah, and actually, there's a question in the chat, which is something we were talking about coming into, especially on this slide, about paying ransoms and what is the, you know, the industry has been paying ransoms. A lot of people have been paying ransoms to stay off the shaming sites to get their data back. And it's just built the industry bigger. And now the US government's starting to put pressure on people to stop paying those ransoms, especially since a lot of that money goes to terrorist organizations and things like that. I don't really have any good answers about if we're gonna be able to continue paying ransoms, what the outcome of that new guidance from the government is. It's very new and treading new waters for all of us, I think.
Yeah, so the specific recent opinion that came out from, and it was an advisory opinion from the Department of Treasury, a leg of it that handles foreign exchange. And so we call those OFAC regulations. So companies that deal regularly with paying ransoms should have and have, the reputable ones, done research into those regulations and how to handle them from a legal perspective. And so the chances are, if you're working with professionals, they are going to really know the ins and outs of those regulations, because what you don't want to do is pay a ransom and think you don't have any other legal obligations surrounding that, but you're setting yourself up. So there is some hesitancy for people to pay those ransoms. However, sometimes you're in a business situation where you're forced to pay it because you cannot recreate the data. So I think there is, you know, a bit of regulation that you want to work with professionals to make sure you're complying with law.
Yeah, and on that note too, and one of the questions here, should we notify law enforcement when we have a breach like this? And that's really, again, up to you based on your industry. Some industries do require law enforcement notification. Your attorney is going to help you kind of navigate that. Generally, it's really only going to be a notification. In almost no situation are they going to be able to provide you any assistance in finding the bad guy or really anything else. They just get it for their records and pass it on to, you know, kind of their statistics to some extent. So this slide has some common pitfalls that people, things that go wrong on that initial response that we see in a lot of cases. The first one is destroying critical data. And by this, I mean, you know, people say, oh, we've got the decryptors, so let's, or we've got backups, so let's delete all the encrypted files and then restore our backups. So they delete the encrypted files and then find out that the backups are corrupt or for whatever reason they can't restore. Well, if you've deleted the encrypted files, now you've lost the opportunity to pay the ransom and decrypt them. Or, you know, in a similar vein, virtual servers, we see this a lot, deleting a virtual server to restore it. And then again, we can't get back to that original virtual server because we needed the space. So slow down a little bit in that initial response and get a copy of all that data before you start overriding it. Because unless you know for sure, absolutely sure that your data that you're restoring is good, you're just putting yourself at a risk there. And in a similar vein, not preserving logs. So most people don't know this, but Microsoft Windows the default settings for the security event log will only store 2 to 3 days worth of data. And a lot of, our clients find out about this, our forensic clients find out about this, when we start the investigation. The first thing we say is, hey, get me a copy of those logs on your domain controllers, because if you haven't changed your default settings, they only have like 2 days, but even the last 2 days is better than nothing. So grab those logs, or even better, start increasing that log retention now, and then grab those logs right away. The first thing you do as part of the response. I think Sarah kind of hit on this a little bit, but we do see organizations making those overly optimistic assumptions like, oh, that data would have been hard to find. They would have had to actually extract the database, and I don't think they took that, so we're not going to notify based on that. And then, a week later in the investigation, or some weeks later, because of some other information comes out, you found out that indeed the attacker did go through those more complex steps to get to that sensitive data. And now you've maybe already shared some misinformation about the impact. So yeah, don't underestimate these attackers, and don't make, assumptions, even though it's very tempting to, that are overly optimistic to reduce your burden or things like that. Be aware the attacker's kind of staying engaged. There's an instance that I heard of a situation where a city government was attacked with ransomware, and so they had basically an open community meeting to discuss whether or not they pay the ransom. And during that meeting, the insurance policy limit was discussed, which the attacker then reached out and changed his ransom demand to match the insurance policy limit, increased the ransom demand, kind of knowing that there may be more money available there. So think about, are they watching your email, or do they have other access to the information that you're discussing? Now, I talked about moving too fast. I don't know, Sarah, if you want to talk about moving too slow.
Yeah, so sometimes, you see that people, they take a couple days to call their broker, they take a couple days to get, their attorney lined up, or their forensic company lined up. And so you do want to be moving with a little bit of a clip to your pace because of those notification deadlines that Zach talked about earlier. So it is an important issue to keep things moving, keep the ball rolling. This is something we often take calls on over the weekend and at night as attorneys and as forensic companies to make sure people are moving fast enough. Next slide.
So yeah, Harry, you had asked a couple questions in chat that I was just kind of holding on to for this slide. So the big question, okay, I'm scared now. How do I make sure this doesn't happen to me? And so the biggest thing, I think, is stepping back and looking at your backups and thinking about your backups from the perspective of, if an attacker was on my network, had all my admin passwords, would they be able to delete or destroy my backups? And a lot of times the answer is yes, because those backups are on other file servers or storage appliances, or on a backup exec server that's part of the domain or something like that. So there's a few ways you can protect your backups. One of them is backing up to offline media. So backing up to tapes and then taking those tapes out of the drive or the library every day. So you're at least a day behind. Or in a very small organization, maybe even that's just USB drives. Have 2 USB drives that you back up to. Every night it backs up to the other drive, and just swap them out every day. So that you've got one drive on the shelf during an attack. Another one is, if you're in a bigger organization, placing those backup servers and other things that the attackers are going after. Hypervisors, which are the administrative console for your virtual servers, or storage appliances. These are like basically servers that contain lots of disks that might have file shares, or disks that are used by other servers or things like that. So those things that hold data or hold applications, you put those administrative consoles in what's called a hardened enclave. It's a separate segment of your network that's maybe behind its own firewall, and you have to use a different password or multi-factor authentication to get into it. It just keeps the attacker, even if they've stolen all your network admin passwords, from being able to use those on those critical servers. And then finally, backing up to cloud services that use multi-factor authentication. So there's a myriad of cloud backup solutions nowadays. Most, I would assume all of them, have certain protections to make sure that an attacker can't just check a box and click a button and delete all your backups. You know, just being aware if your backups are on the network and not redundant somewhere else where the attacker can't reach them, they're at risk. The next one, multi-factor authentication on all remote access. So almost all of these ransomware attacks involve some type of remote access. It's the attacker stealing a password and then using a remote desktop service or a VPN service, or even just, you know, getting a password for email as a foothold for more phishing attacks or for stealing other passwords. So we're, you know, all of our clients, we're recommending across the board that everybody have multi-factor authentication, or for email, sometimes they call it multi-step authentication, just to make sure that a stolen password doesn't give an attacker access to anything. The next one is limit your Microsoft Active Directory domain admin accounts and how those are used. So once attackers get a small foothold, maybe one PC on the network, their next objective is to become a domain admin, so they can own the whole network and start encrypting servers and things like that. For most organizations, domain admin accounts there's more people who have them than need them. Those people use them maybe for their day-to-day things like logging in and viewing email. If you change how you use domain admins, that only a few people have them, those few people only use them from their workstation and only use them to log into the domain controller, it really limits the attacker's ability to get their hands on those domain admin accounts and make use of them to attack the whole network. Restricting outbound traffic. So once that attacker has the foothold, almost always they're installing backdoors for what we call command and control channels. So this allows some virus on the internal network to talk out through the firewall, maybe using web protocols, maybe using other protocols like chat or even like game server protocols or things like that, to talk to the attacker's servers out on the internet and get instructions, either leak data or attack other systems or things like that. You have an opportunity to stop these types of command and control channels by adding things like content-based web filtering and then a default deny of any other protocols that go out of your firewall. So even if the attacker does infect one system, that system can't get new instructions to the attacker to, you know, spread the attack further. Reviewing your antivirus coverage and configuration. So what I mean by this is, you know, you should really have a good commercial antivirus. Don't just use the one that, you know, kind of came pre-installed on the PC or the one that's just built into Windows. It doesn't have quite as many bells and whistles. Get good commercial antivirus, and then, you know, make sure it's installed everywhere. We see a lot of organizations that skip certain servers like domain controllers or database servers because they're like, it could have an impact and users aren't logging in there anyway. But those are the first things that the attackers hit with ransomware. Good to have antivirus there. It's not going to stop everything, but it'll stop a lot. And then in that antivirus, look at the configuration. Turn on those optional features. Some have a feature called a ransomware canary, where the antivirus actually puts files around on the system and just monitors those files. And as soon as someone tries to encrypt one of those files, it's going to trip and say, hey, you've got ransomware, and just shut down the system from talking on the network and encrypting other files and things like that. And other features like they call it heuristic threat detection or host IDS. It does more than just antivirus to look at the behaviors of the computer and see if they're suspicious behaviors like encrypting a lot of data. And then lastly, getting a subscription service for regular phishing awareness exercises. We used to say just teach your employees about phishing, but we're really finding in practice the only good way to teach your employees about phishing is to give them real phishing messages coming in their inbox, that they're, you know, seeing those, thinking about them, and maybe failing once or twice and clicking on them and getting a little chastised for that. And these, you know, subscription services for that phishing awareness do a really nice job of reducing how often employees click on ransomware or click on phishing attacks.
Yeah, so one thing you can do to prepare is to get those those partners lined up beforehand. So, you know, work with your insurance company or your broker to get a attorney that you like pre-approved, to get a forensic team that you like pre-approved. If you don't do this in advance, most cyber liability insurance policies are going to require that you use their paneled counsel. And so you'll have a list of attorneys or a list of forensic teams you can pick from. And sometimes those people may have never worked with you before. So if you do have a preference for a particular person, most insurance companies will help you work with them to pick someone in advance. And Jason can talk a little bit more about kind of how he sees that play out, but that is something we do recommend.
Yeah, the specifics of it is exactly like Sarah said. A true cyber insurance policy is going to line up all of these services and expertise areas that we've talked about today, whether it be rapid response IT, legal, breach notification experts, PR firms. All of that is what's covered under an insurance policy. Exactly as Sarah said, if you've not done the pre-work to say, this is who I want to work with, you will work with panel counsel. However, a true, in the very top cyber carriers in the world, also will let you use a non-panel counsel at the time of need, but there will be a carve out of what limits available. It will be different, but those are things that you should have discussions with in advance to exactly know what works best for you. It's all laid out very clear. You just have to be strategic and focused on what you want to do before the loss occurs.
Next slide, please. So as we mentioned, you do want to have a couple of policies and plans in place, and one of those is an incident response plan. So your incident response plan is going to walk through exactly what we're covering today. What do you do when a security incident happens? Who's the decision maker? A lot of companies, they'll have a committee or a team of people, maybe the head of HR, you know, it could be someone that is a CEO or the owner of the company if it's a small company, maybe a controller or a CFO. So you really want to have the decision makers in place already to follow the plan. And then the plan will walk through how do you respond. You also want to have a written information security policy and plan, or what we call a WISP. And your WISP is going to go through, you know, what security measures you have in place. It would say, you know, list some of those items that Kevin was talking about as best practices, you know, where are your backups, how often is it backed up? So it would walk through, you know, what kind of information you have. Do you have sensitive confidential information? Do you have customer confidential information? What are the steps that we require employees to have for remote access? What are the password requirements for our systems? So your WISP is going to walk through those basic security procedures that everyone in your company should be following. So this is something that you train your employees on, and that you should have enforcement of with your employees. So if someone's not following the WISP, they could potentially get a write-up, they could potentially be fired. Next slide, thank you. Another piece of, you know, preparing is really knowing what laws you're subject to. As Zach said before, you know, there are some industry specific laws for healthcare or financial services. So you do want to have a good handle on that beforehand. And that will give you a good idea of where you need to go for your notification obligations. If you are in an industry where you are handling banking instructions or wire transfer instructions, it might be a good idea just to set an expectation with your vendors and customers that, you know, hey, we're never going to email you wiring instructions from an account last minute. You know, we're always going to call and verify wiring instructions. You know, we're never going to call you on a support communication. We're only going to use this dedicated chat portal. So setting those communication expectations with your customers and vendors can be really important. You also want to have good contracts in place related to security and notification of any security issues, and that's where your vendor management is going to come in place. So you do want to know, is there a contract that requires my vendor to notify me if they have a ransomware event? So that's all really important to get on the front end. Finally, you do want to document the security efforts you are taking. So, if you are doing an annual audit, if you are annually sitting down to review your policies, that's something you want to keep a track of and just make sure that you're demonstrating a good record of having good security culture at your organization. The next slide.
I know we're running a little bit of short on time here, so I'm gonna go through these a little quicker than I normally would be, and would be happy offline later to speak in more detail about this. But here's the bottom line of what happens from the insurance perspective. As I said, a true cyber insurance policy that is specific to this area of focus will cover all of the areas that we've talked about. Just because it says the word cyber on your insurance policy does not mean it's going to help you in your time of need. And if I can't stress anything more, that's what I want you remembering about it. It's a really bad time to find out at the time of loss that there are these pitfalls built in within your specific cyber policy. And those are exclusions generally, or they are only certain coverage sections. Liability only, for example, still having war and terrorism exclusions. Those are big pitfalls that people get into. And again, it's very bad to find out at the time of loss. So what you need to be doing more than any other line of insurance you deal with, because unlike your property and workers' compensation insurance, which doesn't change too much from year over year, there will be absolutely new cyber coverages and threats and attacks that change every few months. Those need to be absolutely added and updated as you prepare for each term, and if not talking multiple times a year. Because as I said, it's a real bad time to find out at the time of loss that you didn't have that strategic conversation. It's not contemplated. Think first party cyber coverages. That is what is repaying you your money for all of these services. And that's what you're really paying for with insurance. If the limits take care of the services, the IT response, the legal, the breach coaches, the PR firms, the loss of income if you're a manufacturing firm, for example. So look and focus on those areas and pay specific attention to that. So we can go to the next slide in the interest of time. So as we've talked about over and over and over today, you've got to have this plan built in place, and you need to be strategic and focused about it. And one of the things we're real big on, and you'll see this in the presentation here when you get the notes, is that you have to have the continuity plan, whatever the term you want to call it is. But it's an action plan in really what we say is 4 specific areas: the training and education and scenario-based practices. Best practices on your IT and vendor management side, as Sarah and Kevin and Zach have talked about today, as well as the legal side. As Sarah was just saying, if you are an organization that does a lot of wire transfers, can you use EFT? Are you using dual authorization? Are you using tokenization? There's reasons those are out there and available because they will help mitigate risk. The last piece of this plan is the insurance. If you need to use it, it means you've had a claim. So it better be really good, and you better have been strategic about how you put that insurance program in place. But you've got to have steps 1 through 3 done first before you get to the insurance side of things, which is why it's a part of the overall program. And obviously, in the interest of time here, we'd love to go into a lot more, but we'll go to the next slide for today's purposes.
All right, thanks, Jason. Yeah, if we go to the next slide. So Sikich has a number of ways we can help you navigate this as well. We're a professional services firm. I work in the cybersecurity practice. So in addition to being a forensic investigator, you can call us to help you if you have one of these incidents. We are kind of a full service cybersecurity firm. So if you want help measuring if you're resilient against this through things like vulnerability scanning or penetration testing, we can help with that. If you want help developing your security program, improving it with like a risk assessment or an audit against like a CIS or other industry frameworks, we can help with that. But yeah, it's important to kind of get started with this before the attack, look at your posture, fill in those gaps, and have a partner ready if something bad does happen. Move on to the next slide.
Yeah, so for Godfrey and Con and what an attorney can do for you, an attorney can help you in that moment. Like we said, analyze your legal obligations, but there's also a ton of other legal services you can do. So we can help you with drafting those incident response plans, advising on legal policies you should have, such as that WISP or an acceptable use policy. Also, we do practice tabletop exercises where we actually sit down with clients and we run through a pretend security incident or breach. And we often will pair with security companies like Kevin's, who we will run both a legal and a technical tabletop exercise where you practice responding to a incident. So that's just some of the things we can do, or attorneys can help you with for being prepared to handle a security incident.
I think we're at the Q&A part. So thank you all very much. There are a lot of questions, and I know there are a lot of business owners on the line. As a business owner myself, let's get into probably the question that most people have. Let's talk about the costs. From the range of cybersecurity insurance and all the different elements, and then the cost of legal and the remediation, and where does the ransomware range of costs come in? How much downtime, that tough to measure cost, but if you're down for 2 weeks and can't operate your business, that's a huge cost. And why wouldn't somebody do the preventative if it makes sense? So what are the costs to be prepared on the prevention side? And if you don't and or do, what does something like this cost in terms of hard dollars?
I'll jump in. Yeah, I'll jump in from the insurance side. I think it's a question we get asked a lot as well. It's a lot more affordable than most people think. For pretty much almost all businesses, let's say under $75 million in annual revenue, a true, real cyber insurance policy that's going to cover first party, third party, and the cybercrime coverages, depending on exactly which industry you are in and your total sales, but it's going to be anywhere from, on the low end, maybe $2,000 a year, on the high end for that same range, maybe up to $4,500, $5,000 a year. So while I understand that's real money, when you look at it from a business owner's perspective, again, that's taking care of up to a limit that you choose of, let's say $1 million or $2 million. That's going to pay for all of those services that we just got into. And so if you look at, most of the time they'll have a $2,500 or a $5,000 deductible associated with it. So if you look at your all-in cost, let's pick $4,000 as your premium plus a $5,000 deductible. Your total out-of-pocket cost is $9,000 a year. And then you've transferred all of the risk after that to the carrier. A small claim we see nowadays is easily $100,000 in terms of all-in costs. So it's, yes, I understand $4,000 is a lot of money, but in the grand scheme of things, when you have one of these events, you are transferring the financial loss to the carrier, which is what we see as the folks that are unfortunately going through this have made the good bet when they've placed that in effect before the loss occurs.
And I will say another benefit of having insurance is often those providers that you have either gotten pre-approved or work with the insurance company regularly have negotiated rates. So you're going to get a lower rate for an attorney and a lower rate for a forensic team to come in if you are doing it through an insurance company rather than just doing it in the moment, immediate, with no insurance coverage. So it is another financial benefit to having that coverage.
So talk about the ransomware. Let's say I didn't have coverage and I come to the office on Monday morning and I see that there's a big problem. There's the data, there's the employee information, the customer information. Where does ransomware dollars figure in, and how much, what's the range, and how often is that paid and not paid by companies? If you didn't have insurance, if you weren't prepared, it sounds like $100,000 might be on average, but let's talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, we've seen ransom demands from the $10,000 ranges up to $10 million. And the attackers, again, they're getting in there and poking around to get to know you before they start encrypting stuff. So they have some sense for your, business size, your asset size, and how much damage and how much you might be able to pay. So we really do see them putting up ransom demands that are painful for the organization, but maybe also reasonable for the organization.
So they're looking at your financials. They know your balance sheet.
To some extent, possibly. Yeah, I don't know where they're getting the information, but yeah, like I've definitely seen, like, I had a client where they called me up and they said, yeah, the attackers are asking for $10 million, and I was almost floored. And then they're like, if they were asking more like 5, we might pay it.
Oh my God.
So yeah, they were that size, and they do really kind of size it appropriately from what I've seen.
And I guess they have to live for another day, because if they ask for too much and don't ever get it, they're out of business too. It's crazy. Let's talk about the backup situation a little bit more. So you mentioned it earlier, but what and where are the biggest risks? But first, talk about the backup. Offsite, cloud. You say come in with a new server. Replace it every day. Where is the biggest risk? And realizing that most companies are the small to mid-sized companies,
right?
Not be IT'd up in terms of investing, and what kinds of trends have you seen, or do you recommend them?
Well, it's really just stopping to take, as Sarah said, ask your service provider how the backups are being done, and because people built these backups 5-10 years ago, thinking about natural disaster generally. If we had a fire, a flood, a tornado, and so they've been designed not thinking about an attacker. So you need to go back, talk to your service provider, your IT staff, to say, let's talk about our backups thinking about an attacker, and really find the solution from there. Are they protected because they're offline? Are they protected because an attacker couldn't use just passwords to get to them? Or, in this cloud service, these are the protections of the cloud service. There's a lot of ways to do it, and it really depends on your environment or your cloud service provider or your partner. But the fundamental question is, could an attacker destroy our backups somehow? And if so, what can we change to prevent that?
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about passwords and remote workforce. Today's situation is most companies have some, if not most, of their workers working at home, unless you're, let's say, a manufacturing company making widgets, where you obviously can't do that. Is that one of the most vulnerable areas, with those employees working at home on their Wi-Fi service, going and accessing your company information? And how do you get around that? And what can you do? That's you might have mentioned it earlier in terms of coursework, and you got to follow these guidelines. But what are some other ideas that companies probably need to start doing immediately if they're not?
So I can share some suggestions here. So after ransomware attacks, which are kind of, again, the most damaging and probably one of the most common attacks we're seeing, which often involves stolen passwords, the next most common, from my perspective, is account takeover attacks. This is where they take over an email account or maybe some other cloud service account and use that to do social engineering, to try and do, make fraudulent payments or cause fraudulent payments to happen, to attack other people, to reset other passwords. So both of those attacks really come down to, at some point, an attacker making use of a password that they stole, that they found online in a breach, like we saw earlier, that they guessed, because one of the common attacks is called password spraying. So if your organization has password policies that says it's 8 characters, including password complexity, and you have to change it every 90 days, well, out of 100 employees, I would bet you one of your employees' password right now is fall 2020 with a capital F, because that changes every 90 days. It meets all the requirements, and they'll never forget what their password is, because in 90 days, it'll be winter 2020. Well, we know that, the attackers know that, and we're just gonna, guess if everybody's using fall 2020 and winter 2020 and password 123, and sooner or later, we'll get that one password and get that one foothold. The biggest thing you can do to improve your passwords is require passphrases instead. And when we say passphrases, we mean switch to 16+ characters but make that easier for your employees by not requiring password complexity, maybe even taking away the password rotation rules. Because once you have 16 plus characters, people aren't reusing those passwords online. Our computers can't crack those passwords, can't, brute force guess them. So the lead hackers can't get to them if they steal the encrypted passwords. And they're just not guessable. There's no winter 2020 that's 16 characters. So yeah, passphrases, huge benefit to the industry if everybody moved to that. You still need multi-factor authentication for the remote access services for things like keyloggers or phishing attacks and things like that.
How often would you recommend changing a password phrase?
So the NIST guideline that came out a couple years ago, and this is a big standards body, actually said that if you switch to passphrases and enforce long ones, that they recommend only changing passwords when there's a reason to. For example, an employee leaves or you think the passwords were disclosed. Otherwise, Microsoft didn't really come out with a recommendation, but they removed password rotation from their list of best practice recommendations. So certain parts of the industry are actually moving towards, don't worry about rotating your password as long as it's long and as long as you protect it.
So what do you say to the company that believes they're too small or too specialized and they don't have to worry about this risk? Their belief is, not me, I don't have enough money, who wants my data? I'm just making screws and widgets, so what's the big deal? And a follow-up, and maybe Jason, what percentage of the companies out there do you think have coverage for this kind of a threat?
Yeah, I'll take the first part specifically of I don't care if you're a 2-person organization or if you're a 1,000-person organization, you have information. You have personal information of your employees, your suppliers, your vendors, the product that you make. Even if they can't, even if a ransom situation is not what their end all be all is for you, if they gain information on your suppliers, vendors, folks that you work with to run your business, that's a win for them because they still, their web continues to grow and they've got another avenue of who they then can go after. So again, everybody's vulnerable. There is no person too small or too big in this situation of crime. Second part specifically, it's a really interesting trend as this becomes more and more prevalent. I mean, just about everybody in their personal life has probably been compromised at one point or another. We're now seeing that trend move to businesses. So where a year ago at this point, for example, we might have worked with 3 to 4 people a week. Now we're working with probably double that. And the whole area is because of frequency, right? And we know in the risk management world, frequency eventually leads to severity. So you start playing the numbers, and that's what this is. It's a numbers game. Those who have been associated with or known somebody that's got impacted, it's now becoming more of an important factor in their business. We've actually seen, so we probably have a lot of leadership on the call. We've now seen directors and officers lawsuits at the management teams for people failing to have proper, not only insurance in place to protect this loss, but an action plan in place, like we've all been talking about this entire call, that you're not doing your leadership job if you don't have these plans in place pre-loss. So that's why we're seeing more and more people gravitating toward putting this in place.
There was a question about...
I should just jump in there really quick, Dan. I was going to also point out there's a reason I haven't said much in the last few minutes, which is because I do sort of the backside of this. Once the breach has happened, I jump in and help with any litigation that results. But one thing we've been seeing more and more cases addressing are the terms of insurance contracts and when they will step in and cover a loss. And so this goes really to a point that Jason was making towards the end of the slide deck, which is you really have to look at your insurance policy closely and make sure that it's going to cover the loss that you might claim, because we are seeing just a real increase in litigation over what your insurance contract means, basically. And I think that that's a result of more and more businesses opting to buy this insurance, but then not necessarily knowing the contents of that insurance, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. As a business owner, that makes a lot of sense. Speaking of the legal end of things, there was a question about when and if you involve law enforcement. Zach and Sarah, maybe you can handle that, or any of the others if that's something that comes up and you're asked to deal with?
Yeah, so this often comes up, and there are some state notification laws, particularly New York, that requires you to notify the state police in certain instances. However, for the most part, if you call your local law enforcement, they will probably take a statement from you, but they will have zero idea of what to do with it. And that's because a lot of our local law enforcement isn't trained on cybercrime. And so, you know, I would always recommend talking to your attorney about whether you do report something. The one instance where you might want to get the FBI involved sooner is if there is a wire transfer that is going overseas or is going to the wrong location due to some false wiring instructions or incorrect wiring instructions. If you can get in touch with the FBI, usually within 12 to 24 hours, sometimes up to 72 depending, there is a chance that you could get them to stop that transfer from going overseas or going to a bad bank account where the money is going to be stolen. You have to act very fast to do that, and it has to be an extremely large amount. Typically, the FBI is not going to get involved unless the loss is over $250,000. So for most of us, that's going to be, you know, something that we're not meeting that minimum threshold for them to really get involved. So usually we don't see a ton of law enforcement involvement in this area. But sometimes people do report as legally required, or if they would like to report for PR purposes.
Sure. Before we end, I'm going to ask if each of you, or you can talk about some war stories, but there's some quick questions that I'd like to get through that Jerome had sent in. Should you check the box for the Windows ransomware? Any good? What software do you recommend? And WISP template ? Those are 3 questions by one of the attendees.
Yeah, I think a lot on the Windows ransomware box, any features that your antivirus might have or other control might have that specifically targets ransomware, like that canary stuff or whatever, I would say definitely enable. It's not, don't expect it to be perfect and block everyone, but certainly it's gonna get you one step closer, maybe block the one that happens to hit you, or at least, you know, notify you of it earlier or something like that. Yeah, turn on any features of your antivirus. The question about what software do you recommend? Like there's such, on an antivirus side, like I don't recommend one over the other, just a good commercial one that seems to have more than just the basic antivirus. Like I said, if it's got features specifically around ransomware and threat prevention, things like that, it's good. And I don't know, the WISP templates, we don't have any of those kind of freely available. I think you can probably Google around and find a lot of that, examples of that, especially from some government organizations have to make theirs available, so they make good templates.
Yeah, I will say for the tools, never put all of your security eggs in one tool basket. You should always have a layered security approach. And what that means is you're going to have multiple different tools or multiple different ways to protect your system. So you're not just relying on one tool. That is something that's critically important, is that you have layered security within your network. For recommendations for WISPs, Massachusetts has some good resources available through their Attorney General website, especially some, I do believe they have a template WISP available. There are also some small business organizations that have templates available that you can find online. They're a good basis. What I like to recommend for smaller and medium-sized companies that maybe don't have a huge IT team is to look at some of the frameworks that are out there and really go through that framework and say, what can we do? What's appropriate to our size, and which of these framework controls can we adopt? So, you know, I'm not expecting, or nor do I recommend, that a small company go out and sign up for, you know, the entirety of a large cybersecurity framework such as NIST. That's NIST. But you can go through and pick out what are some important ones that we can adjust, and that will give you a good roadmap for what you should be thinking about for your security controls. Great,
thank you. So before we conclude, let's hear some war stories. We scared people when we first started this program. Let's continue to scare them. It seems like it's a no-brainer. If you don't have a plan, you need to get a plan, because the cost of not doing it seems to be far, far, far greater than the cost of being proactive and making a plan. But let's hear some war stories or some examples of things that you all have experienced out there.
I have one that I can lead with because we've seen it a couple times now, and I think it's a very low-tech thing that we've seen happen, which is somebody registers a domain name, an attacker registers a domain name that's very, very similar to the business that they want to spoof, basically. So I'll use Biz Times because it has an M in it. They might register TINNES.com instead of TIMES.com. And then they could send emails from that domain account and to your average employee who's not looking at the from line or to line. It looks exactly like it's coming from Biz Times. And so if there's an invoice attached with wiring instructions, something like that, it's a pretty common way of initiating a funds transfer to a place where it shouldn't be going. And there's really no cyber direct cyber attack. It's not a virus that gets on your computer. It's not ransomware. There's no password guessing, anything like that. So it's a pretty low tech way of getting your money.
Yeah, wow. Thanks for sharing that.
I'll bounce off that, and exactly as Zach said, I think the thing that I would like most of our customers and people on this call to understand is this is in all likelihood not going to break in through your IT department. You're going to target your employees through very low-level, sophisticated social engineering scams. The goal is to get somebody to be human and make a mistake. And that's what you're trying to do, exactly as the scenario that Zach just pointed out. And all the losses that we go through, you get an employee to fall for something, and these criminals will know about your employees down to your employee level. They will know what they do in their personal lives, what activities they do, where they live, where you go to school, and you prey on that. And that's, people are people, right? And so you can never completely mitigate this risk out, which is why training and education of your staff is so important. And as Kevin brought up, then practicing for it. It's like anything in life that we have to practice for. When we know there's a frequency situation, you need to have that plan in place, which we keep hitting on over and over. But the number one way into people is through low-level attacks on your employees, tricking them. And we see it every single week.
Yeah, and we do a lot of this social engineering testing. And when you're making these phone calls, like the video at the very beginning here, your thought is, no way is anybody going to fall for this. They're going to see right through it. They're not going to do whatever I ask them to do. But the real answer is they fall for it very often because people just tend to want to help when you call them, especially when you call them at work.
They're a customer service person. They're supposed to like people and help people.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, and so, if I fish somebody with an email that says, hey, here's an update from the help desk, please run this, they're going to probably ignore it. But if I call them an hour later and say, hey, Sarah, I sent you an email an hour ago with an update. We really need to get this run. Did you try to run it? Did you get an error message? And a lot of times that personal contact makes that thought that it's a phishing attack just all go away, and we'll get that foothold.
Wow. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think one of the questions was, how often do we see something personalized in a phishing email? And I see that quite frequently. So a lot of times, as Jason mentioned, people are doing a lot of research. I've seen it where they get a hold of an invoice from a company and they know how to replicate it. They take your signature line from, online. They copy and paste your logo that they find online. They know your role, your title. And also they, I think a lot of the good phishing emails nowadays, they're not in broken English. They don't have a lot of typos. They look like they very well could be coming from the CEO of the company. And so I think you got to keep a heightened awareness, and you got to do a lot of training, because if you don't have a culture of security and you're not training your employees, then they're the weakest link in your chain. So I think just making sure you train is really important, and a good preventative.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback off of that, how they're personalizing and even getting the invoices. We're seeing a lot of attacks. Again, it's that email account takeover where either your accounts payable person's mailbox got taken over or some business partner that they exchange emails with gets taken over. But the attackers do things when they've got that mailbox, like set up kind of complicated forwarding rules. So if that business partner were to send you an email, when it gets to your mailbox, you don't see it, but it gets forwarded to the attacker, they see it. The attacker can change it by, for example, changing the bank account numbers in the invoice and then send you their modified version. So you were expecting this invoice from that partner. It looks exactly correct. It's just like the one you received last month, and you process it, and the attacker kind of changed it along the way. So any type of transactions you're doing by email, you really need to, even if they're monthly ones, need to be validating key things like bank account numbers via voice, to not fall for that kind of thing.
Wow, scary, scary stuff. Well, that concludes the program. We should end it there. I do want to thank all of our presenters: Jason Navarro, Cyber Crime Director with Arnold Insurance Services; Kevin Bong, Director of Cybersecurity with Sikich; Sarah Sargent and Zach Willenbrink, Associates with Godfrey & Kahn. These are the experts. You see their contact information on the screen. You'll have access to it. You can contact them at any time. I know that they're available to help you deal with the reality and the urgency of mitigating your exposure to cyber threats to your business. So as I mentioned, the slide deck will be available online when you exit the webcast. A new tab will open in your browser with the survey. Please fill out the survey where you can access the slide deck from today. So we value your feedback as we look to have more webcasts like this in the future. On behalf of BT360 and BizTimes Media and our presenters, thanks again for everyone for taking your time out of your busy day. And with that, have a great rest of the day. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.